Okay, welcome to another version of our Lunch and Learn series. This is sponsored by the IIBA of Tampa Bay, so there's a big call out to the IIBA of Tampa Bay. If you're new to the series, my name's Richard Frederick, and I'm an instructor. I teach a course called Business Data Analytics, specific to requirements and project management for business data analytics, the language of business. And I start off the class talking about if you're struggling with requirements, you're not alone. Everybody struggles with requirements. That's why there's so many logos on the slide. All of these are different standards that exist to try to help us as analysts kind of wrap our arms around the challenge of requirements. And it is a challenge, which is why we're paid money to go do it. This particular session is about Waterfall and Agile. The class itself is a traditional requirements class. The difference is that it focuses on business data analytics, the language of data, and the reason it focuses on that is because of the digital transformation, which is the new buzzword. It used to be cloud, now it's digital transformation. And the digital transformation really is data. It's all about data, and data is the new oil. So this is a class that is very specifically geared towards helping analysts or project managers, anybody that has to deal with data. So there's a requirements class about data, and there's a project management class about data. A little bit about me. I owned a software company in the late 1990s with a business partner, and we worked to integrate software into solutions to do workflow automation to build actual software robots called Autobots. And was really, really interesting. For the last 15 years, though, I have been training business analysts and project managers on how to do more with less and how to leverage technology to get more work done. So each of these lunch and learns is designed to give you a little piece of information to hopefully help you get your job done more successfully. And the goal is always to seek to understand. I think that that's a great way to look at what we're trying to do, especially as business analysts. And you'll notice on the right-hand side of this slide, there's a bunch of photographs, and they represent job roles, which we talked about in the very first Lunch and Learn quite a few weeks ago. So let me just go through them. The person at the top represents our business analyst product owner. And because this is my course, I get to put those two together. The second person down represents my Scrum Master project manager. The third person would be my IT system architect. The fourth person down would represent just, a developer or a subject matter expert. Underneath that is my QA tester. And then the last individual isn't really an individual at all. It's an intelligent assistant. And the whole premise of the series is to recognize that data is the underlying structure that is necessary to enable intelligent assistance. And that's kind of the mission of the digital transformation, is to give us more data to increase the intelligence of our assistants. And one of the things that I've been trying to, communicate through all these sessions is that, with the experience of actually automating people's jobs, I'm here to tell you that the robots aren't here to take your job. What they are going to do, though, is they're absolutely going to change your job. And the example that I always like to use is the typewriter in email. We had typewriters. I was around when they existed. That's how ancient I am. And I was one of those people that came and took your typewriter after we gave you email. And so email absolutely changed your job. And it was a technology thing that, you could still produce memos and letters, but, it was a new way of doing it. In the future, which the future is now, it's not 20 years from now, it's starting now. It's actually started already. You will leverage an assistant to help you get your job done, whether you like it or not. The assistant is going to be there monitoring what you're doing and offering you suggestions on how to become more productive. The next session that we're going to do a week from now is all about efficiency. And that's where I'm really going to explain the whole premise, like the whole why we're doing this. So hopefully you'll get a chance to come back for that. However, all these sessions are recorded and we post them out so that people can get access to them. So if you're a member of the IIBA, I'm going to go ahead and post these now on the invitation for the event. And then if you came to this through LinkedIn, there'll be a slide at the end where you can just send me an email and I'll send you back both a slide deck and access to the video. In this particular session, and I've got to kind of work very quickly because I'm actually juggling, I'm teaching another class right now. We're going to talk about assembly, waterfall versus agile assembly. And the reason I use the word assembly is because methodology never really made any sense to me. You know, people talk about, well, hey, we got this methodology. Okay. For those of you that have been in the previous sessions, you know that I think in terms of accounting, and from an accounting standpoint, methodology is harder to kind of wrap your arms around. Assembly makes a lot more sense, particularly when you begin to understand that the key to efficiency is reusable inventory. So we're going to talk about software assembly. We're going to talk about waterfall assembly. So software assembly, the concept is analyze, design, code, test, just the generic flow. With waterfall, we're going to talk about scope driving schedule. With agile, we're going to talk about schedule driving scope. And then we're going to just touch on agile planning, roadmap, backlog, and release. So let me go down here. Okay, so assembly methods. So when I started talking with students about methodologies, the one of the fascinating things that came out was the complexity of methodologies. And as I've spent years and years and years trying to explain things to people, my goal has always been to try to simplify, simplify, simplify. So this is about as simplified as I can make it. So software assembly really falls under, you know, four major steps. There's the analysis phase, which is really our role predominantly as analysts. We're a big part of the analysis phase. There's the design phase, which we might be a part of that depending on what our skill set is, or that may be something that is left to more technical professionals. Obviously, there's the coding aspect of it, and then there's testing. So if you look at the world kind of through those four steps, it's an assembly process. So here it is looking more like an assembly process where we have a requirements engineer, which would be us, theoretically the analyst or product owner. We'd have our architects, our developer, and our QA tester, which again, I showed you the list of the people at the beginning. What I really want to do here is just talk about assembly though. The big takeaway from this is that there really isn't that much of a dramatic difference between waterfall and agile when you look at it from an assembly process. And that was the thing that I was trying to get to is, you know, there's a big movement towards agile today, and that's awesome. I don't have anything against agile, but as a business analyst or product owner, you need to be aware of the fact that there still are waterfall projects that you might be required to participate on. So not everything can be done in agile. I mean, building a building, it would be very difficult to do in agile. So what are the parts? So let's talk about there's four things you need to understand about assembly, just four. So we'll make it really simple. What are you trying to assemble? What are the parts that you're assembling? That's your scope. How long is it going to take you to assemble them? That's your schedule. How complex is it? That's your risk. And how much are you going to spend? That's your cost. So there's a lot of communication between, you know, what's the difference between waterfall and agile? And really it boils down to just two simple concepts. In waterfall, your scope actually drives your schedule. So what happens is you're going to break things down into, you know, decompose or decomposition into small pieces, and then you're going to line everything up on a schedule. So your scope drives your schedule. Your schedule will be determined by, you know, how much scope you've got available that you have to build. With Agile, we flip it around where your schedule really dictates your scope. So let me just start on the left-hand side with Waterfall. In Waterfall, you lock down your scope, then you assemble these transactions along a critical path schedule. And the risks are measured against the overall project scope, and there's an adjustment to the schedule that's managed through something known as contingency reserve. And generally speaking, in Waterfall, work is assigned top-down. In Agile, your scope drives your schedule. And what you're really trying to do is you lock down your schedule in the form of what we call a sprint, like a 2-week sprint or a 3-week sprint. In this session, we're just going to deal with 2 weeks, and I'll explain why as we get to that. Then you determine how much of your scope in the form of story points will fit within a 2-week sprint of about 80 business hours. The risks are measured against scope to identify complexity and calculate those story point values, and the work is selected bottom up. So when you're looking at kind of a difference between them, Waterfall tends to be known as more of a predictive model. You're trying to figure it out in advance and sort of have it all set up in advance, and then you go to execute. Versus Agile, which is an adaptive model where you might have some of it set up in advance, but you're allowing yourself a lot of flexibility in your ability to manage change as you move through your process. So where Waterfall doesn't really like change, Agile embraces change. So that's a kind of a key difference between those two. So let's talk about Waterfall, where your scope drives your schedule. So Waterfall has been around a long time. I mean, it's how we build physical, tangible assets. And with Waterfall, you break down a product into discrete, individual, tangible assets called work packages. And that word discrete is really important because discrete is the smallest thing you're going to identify in your plan. For some people, discrete might be, one remote control. For someone else, discrete might be each part of the remote control. So again, that definition changes based on each project and each organization and what you're trying to do. The idea is to figure out exactly what you're going to assemble in the beginning and then try to lock down the deliverables into a scope baseline with minimal changes. From the scope baseline, you're going to create a list of assembly tasks and activities, which I call discrete transactions for accounting purposes. And at the end of the day, everything that we do as analysts has to somehow fit into institutional accounting systems. So I'm going to be covering those topics later on in future Lunch and Learns. But what you want to do is arrange them along a scheduled timeline called a critical path. Once you have a scheduled timeline, then you analyze how complex or risky the work is to complete. And this risk analysis is then added as a contingency reserve to your project to compensate for any surprises. Finally, knowing all this up front allows you to develop a cost baseline to help track spending. So that's pretty much traditional Waterfall. That's been around for a long time. With Agile, we have kind of I call it a 3-phase approach where we have roadmap, backlog, and release. That's an easy way to kind of remember it. So roadmap is your structure. And depending on who you talk to, some people say, well, we don't really do a whole lot of pre-planning because it's Agile, and that's fine. But generally speaking, there is some planning that's necessary, usually in something called increment 0. And that planning looks very, very similar to a waterfall work breakdown structure. And I find it interesting how, and again, no disrespect to the folks in Agile, but there's this push that's just anti-waterfall. And I don't necessarily know that that always benefits an analyst, because an analyst has to be flexible and be able to work in a lot of different environments. So it's okay to say that a roadmap looks a lot like a work breakdown structure. That's perfectly fine. The structure is vision, and then you might have major themes, and then under those themes, you might have what I basically group together as feature, scope, or epic use cases. Those are your deliverables. And then out of those deliverables, you would have transactional activities in the form of, let's say, user stories or tasks or activities. So feature scope, comprised of user stories of various sizes based on story points. Feature scope has a business value based on either minimize costs or maximize revenue, and feature scope has different priorities that must be defined. So once you've sort of figured out what you want to build, then you put all of that into a backlog. And again, depending on your methodology or your assembly process, you might have multiple backlogs, but we're not going to go there right now. Just real simple, a backlog is really just a database. This is your Jira or your ServiceNow or your Azure DevOps or whatever tool that you use to store all of your transactions that you're going to be assigning to people to do work. So these user stories and tasks are placed in the backlog, generally in order of size, value, and priority. And then once you have them in your backlog, then you put together what's known as a release plan. And at release planning, we decide when our product will meet acceptance criteria and provide business value based upon either reduced cost, increased revenue, or some other key performance indicator that the institution is looking at. Agile Assembly, which is, again, schedule, drive, scope. In Agile Assembly, that's a pretty recent and popular method for assembling non-tangible intellectual property assets like software. So my company was an Agile company. We just didn't call ourselves that. We were a lean software development business. So we've, a lot of similarity, not pure Agile, but there's a lot of similarity to it. With Agile, your schedule is locked down. And when I say locked down, it's your institution is saying, look, we have a set amount of time that we want to look at things, usually 2 weeks in length, called a sprint or an iteration. And it's interesting to me that when I started hearing about, Agile as terminology, and I heard about the sprint and that it was 2 weeks, we started laughing because we'd been operating on a 2-week method or assembly method for many years simply because of payroll. And I have a belief that that's probably, and I could be wrong, but I mean, that's where it may have come from, is the fact that, you pay your developers and you pay your staff every 2 weeks. So it makes sense that you want to show accomplishment every 2 weeks. At least it was for us. That was the mindset. So for us, it was tied to payroll every 2 weeks. The idea behind Agile is to answer the question, how much work scope can you assemble during an 80-hour sprint iteration? So like Waterfall, the work scope is broken down into the smallest pieces, discrete assets and transactions for estimating. However, unlike Waterfall, where the amount of work scope determines the schedule, Agile estimates the amount of work scope based upon how complex or risky it is to assemble. The complexity risk of the work is identified using a subjective measurement called story points. So story points are represented using a sequence of numbers, 1, 3, 5, 8, 13, 20, 40, and 100, for example, based on Fibonacci scales. Nothing like making it really complex, right? To simplify it, to estimate complexity risk, the greater the complexity risk, the higher the story point number. Story point complexity is determined by the team members who break the project into small pieces, discrete components, and then vote on each component's complexity risk. That's your planning poker. If you've ever gone through that or heard about that, that's what that is. So let me give you an example. A discrete component of work with a story point of 40 is far more complex to assemble than a discrete component of work with a story point of 1. And that's the idea behind it, is that the lower the number, the less complex it is, the easier it is to assemble. Once the team agrees to a story point, that number is assigned to that discrete component of work. This allows the team to determine which work should be assembled within a sprint or iteration. I'll explain why I use the word assembly here in a moment after I go through this, as opposed to creation. I'll get to that here in a moment. The total amount of work scope a team can assemble during a sprint iteration is called velocity. For example, one team might have a velocity of 100 story points, while another team might have a velocity of 150 story points. The higher the velocity, the more work the team can assemble. So pretty straightforward. Knowing the estimated velocity of each team allows the product owner, business analyst, and Scrum Master project manager to prioritize and schedule the work scope. Finally, you can use, if you need to, a time and materials accounting approach to develop a cost baseline to track spending. All right, so let me touch on, just before I get into this simplified sprint velocity, let me just touch on why I keep using the word assembly. When you say assembly, what you're really thinking about is the fact that you have already created existing objects of software, hence object-oriented programming, as opposed to having to create objects. So the objects are already created, which makes the process go faster because it's an assembly process. If the objects aren't created, then yes, you have to create those objects from scratch. If you've already done it once and you've got it stored in a source safe, then the process moves much faster than if each time you're having to create something new or recreate something that you've already done in the past, but you didn't save it for reuse. We're going to cover all that in detail next week, but that's kind of the background as to why I use the word assembly, because assembly then is assuming or presuming that your shop is setting things up for reuse to be better organized. Okay, now, everything that I've told you, none of it is locked down as, this is the right way or the wrong way. I don't really know the right or wrong way. I just know that there's certain things that work and there's things that don't necessarily work. And what works for one organization is not guaranteed to work for another. But conceptually, for those of us who are trying to manage lots of resources, the simpler we can set things up, the easier it is to get work through the pipeline of the institution. So I want you to think in terms of simplicity. So for example, a 2-week sprint might represent 10 business days, 8 hours a day, 80 hours. Let's say you have a 5-person team, which is what I showed you, the 5 people on my team. I actually have a 6-person team, but I have intelligence. So, but just in this case, I have five humans and 1 intelligent assistant. 5-person team can complete, let's say, 5 story points per day. Let's just say 5 story points times 5 people times 10 days equals a velocity of about 250 story points for the sprint. For those of you who have to deal with the chief financial officer of your institution, which is what I have to do, and that's the reason why I came up with a lot of this information, was that they wanted this information in something that matches the way that they see the world. So it wasn't enough to just say a story point is complexity. They wanted us to put numbers against it. So 1 story point is approximately 1.5 hours, and 5 story points is approximately 7.5 hours. Great. So now, and again, this is not locked in stone. This is just a concept that you can think about. Now you might have an easier way to communicate with the financial people who want hard numbers against work, which sometimes Agile struggles with. The other thing I want you to keep in mind is that a 52-week calendar year has basically 26 payroll periods or 26 sprints. And knowing that, you could structure all of your work around actual sprint numbers that run from week 1 in the calendar year, or the first 2 weeks in the calendar year, which would be sprint 1, to the last 2 weeks of the calendar year, which would represent sprint 26. Again, that's just something that we look at and the way we think about the world. It's a suggestion more than anything else. So in a nutshell, let me come back. And so all of these events and these lunch and learns are what I call train the trainer. And the goal here is that you take something that you learned and you go teach somebody else. So hopefully you may have picked up something nice and easy that you can go back. So hopefully the big takeaway is, software is an assembly process. There's different kinds of assembly. Waterfall assembly is where the scope drives the schedule. So you got to set up all the scope first and then figure out what your schedule is. The Agile assembly is where the schedule drives the scope. So you say, hey, how much scope can I get done in, let's say, 80 hours? That's going to determine how we're going to put the work together. The Agile planning process really boils down to just 3 things: the roadmap, the backlog, the release. Okay, so that's it. I'm going to open it up for questions. I got a few minutes. So are there any questions anybody might have about anything I just told you? right. No questions? I'm just looking at the text chat. How to sign up for the next session. Ming, if you're a member, are you a member of the IIBA Tampa Bay? The links are up right above in the text chat. So if you go to any of the Facebook group or any of those items, if you look up, you'll see that we have a LinkedIn group. We have the IIBA LinkedIn, we have the IIBA on Facebook, and then we're on Meetup. And if you look under Meetup, we are under IIBA Tampa Bay, and you'll find the sessions there as well. If you are on, Sharon, if you are on LinkedIn, or if you can see on the screen in front of you my email, anybody that wants the slides directly, just send me an email, rfrederick.pmp@gmail.com, and I will send you back the slides, as well as a link to the video. So, what are your thoughts on the hybrid approach? My thoughts are that a lot of places use a hybrid approach. As a matter of fact, it seems to be more often than not that there's a hybrid approach. I know that there are a lot of really awesome agile consultants who are continuously trying to get their companies off of that, but it's kind of hard. I mean, it's very difficult if there's a kind of a history there. But let's see. What do themes constitute on the roadmap? So themes are, just like if you have chapters in a book. So you might have, let's say you're mailing the cookbook and you've got different chapters in your cookbook. Each theme would represent one of those chapters. Great question. Thank you. Okay, Bob, intended use, problem statement, conceptual model, requirements, design, implementation, test, acceptance, right? Anybody else? All right. Yeah, again, this was very short. These are all very short. They're just meant to be, they're not in depth. They're just meant to be, lunch and learns, refreshers. So hopefully the big takeaway, if you're an analyst and you're trying to remember, because I sit in meetings all the time and, my brain is, you're going back and forth and your thoughts are, well, how do I remember waterfall? Just remember scope drives schedule in waterfall. And then in agile, remember that schedule drives scope. And that's how you can differentiate them really quickly. So that was the purpose of this. The recordings, again, just send me an email, rfrederick.pmp@gmail.com, and I'll send you a link to the recordings. Did you get that, Grace? Seems that the analysis phase is sometimes ignored in the agile world at a risk. What are your thoughts? Again, pay me now or pay me later. Either way, you're going to pay. That's what I mean by that is, if you don't do any thought up front, you will pay in a lot more change requests on the backside. And depending on how wealthy your company is, if your company's super wealthy, like your Microsoft or Google or Facebook, then you don't really care about the cost of change because you're wealthy. But if you're on a tight budget, then you do care about the cost of change. And so it does pay to have some upfront planning to try to mitigate a lot of those changes. Now, again, I'm not a purist in any form or fashion. I'm a generalist because I've just been to too many places and I've seen too many things. So I don't necessarily say one size fits all, but I recognize that there's benefits in both approaches, and depending on how your shop is organized, it may be that you need to be more of one or the other, but I don't fit that model. What's the difference between themes and features and epics as your class requirements, as you class your requirements as features or epics? Okay. Features and epics to me are basically the same thing. It's just terminology that people use. Themes are collections of features in epics. So for example, a cookbook. You might have a cookbook that is built around different things. Maybe you have cookbooks that are appetizers and main courses and vegetables and desserts. Great. So those would be your themes. Your epics would be the recipes. So features and epics and user stories and use cases, well, not user stories, but mainly use cases, features, epic, use cases, those are recipes. And then you might have specific user stories within each recipe. Any other questions? Okay, well then, thank you so much for your time, you guys. I'm going to wrap it up here. And just like I said, if you are interested in the slides and a link to the presentation, the link will come later, so it'll take me a little while. Plus, I'm actually teaching another class right now on another Zoom session, so I got to get back to that. But go ahead and just send me an email, or if you're not connected to me on LinkedIn, please connect to me on LinkedIn. Would love to stay in contact with everybody who is part of these sessions. So feel free to do that, and thank you. And if you're connected with me, you'll be able to find out more about joining the IIBA Tampa Bay. It doesn't cost anything to do the meetup version of it, and we'd love to have you become a member of our group. We're over 600 members now, which is really exciting. So, and doing these lunch and learns. All right. So with that, we are over and out. Thank you, everyone.